You know, it's not every day you see a sitting U.S. president get into a public war of words with the Pope, but that's exactly what happened. This wasn't just some minor spat. It was an explosive, global feud that pitted the White House directly against the Vatican. And really, it was more than just a headline. It was a full-on collision of two worlds. So let's break down how this whole thing unfolded.
And this quote right here from Bishop Kai Dare just nails it. It perfectly frames the entire conflict. See, we're not just watching two guys disagree. What we're really watching is two completely different worlds, two totally distinct kinds of authority, crashing into each other on the global stage. It's a clash that gets right to the very heart of who they are and what they represent.
So how did we even get here? Well, the whole firestorm kicked off during a Palm Sunday sermon where Pope Leo said something about war that was immediately seen as a direct shot at the U.S. president and his foreign policy. And the two sides could not have been further apart. On one side, you have Pope Leo, who basically declared that God doesn't listen to the prayers of those who wage war. And on the other, President Trump fired right back, calling the Pope's stance weak, politically motivated, and even dangerous. I mean, there was absolutely zero middle ground here.
And this gets to the real heart of the issue. This isn't just a personal disagreement. It's a conflict between two fundamentally different kinds of power. You've got institutional authority. That's President Trump, right? A leader of a country with an army and an economy. And then you have moral authority. That's Pope Leo, a spiritual leader whose power comes from faith and conscience. When these two types of power clash, it just reveals these huge fault lines in how our world works today.
Well, as you can imagine, the political fallout was instantaneous, and accusations of opportunism and hypocrisy started flying from every direction.
Which leads to the big question that a lot of people started asking. Was this really about a deep theological disagreement, or was this just raw politics wearing religious robes?
Of course, comedian Bill Maher jumped right into the middle of it. He pointed out the irony of political liberals, people who normally disagree with the Catholic Church on almost everything, suddenly rushing to defend the Pope just because he was fighting with Trump. And when you look at the actual issues, you can see exactly what Maher was talking about. On these huge social topics like abortion, gay marriage, and even things like exorcisms, the Pope has these deeply traditional views that are in direct opposition to mainstream liberal stances. But in this one specific fight, many on the left suddenly became his biggest cheerleaders. The Pope's critics took this argument even further, suggesting there was a deliberate political game being played. They claimed that the timing of his statement was designed to hurt Trump with Catholic voters. They pointed to a meeting between the Pope and Obama's former strategist, David Axelrod, and they accused the Pope of having a double standard, coming down hard on the U.S. while staying pretty quiet on severe human rights abuses in places like Iran.
But okay, let's set the politics aside for a second, because beyond all that, this conflict sparked a really fierce theological debate. It became a battle over how to interpret the Bible itself. To back up his claim, Pope Leo went straight to Scripture, quoting from the book of Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 15. This incredibly powerful line about God not listening to prayers from those with hands full of blood became the theological centerpiece of his entire argument against war. But his critics immediately fired back. They argued that the Pope was taking that verse completely out of context. They said, hold on, Isaiah wasn't making some blanket statement against all war. Instead, they claimed, he was calling out the people of Judah for their hypocrisy, for going through religious motions while at the same time oppressing the poor and the vulnerable in their own society.
This whole debate also brings up a really important concept in Christian theology, something called just war theory. This is an idea that was developed by thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas, and it basically holds that war, while it's always tragic, can be morally justifiable if it meets a whole bunch of strict criteria, like having a just cause and being proportional. It's a direct challenge to the idea that Christianity requires total pacifism.
And to support their side of the argument, critics started pointing to other parts of the Bible. They brought up Exodus, which literally calls the Lord a man of war. They cited the Psalms, where King David praises God for training his hands for battle. And they even pointed to the New Testament's book of Revelation, which shows Jesus returning not as a pacifist, but as a conquering warrior. Now, this very public fight wasn't just some random one-off event. For a lot of critics, it was really the flashpoint for a much wider set of worries they had about the entire direction of the Catholic Church under Pope Leo.
These critics started pointing to what they saw as a pattern, a dangerous shift away from traditional doctrine. Things like the Pope's interfaith talks with Islam, which some called a capitulation, his position on open borders, which they labeled unsustainable and unbiblical, and his support for net zero climate policies. For them, the fight with Trump was an isolated thing. It was the most obvious sign yet that the church was drifting away from its core foundations.
And this quote from commentator Ayaan Hirsi Ali really captures the core fear behind that criticism. The worry is that, in trying to achieve interfaith harmony, essential theological differences are getting papered over, which critics see as basically a surrender of Christian identity. To drive home their security concerns, some critics would point to figures like this one, the estimated 700,000 fundamentalist Muslim men in the UK. They use numbers like this to argue that the Pope's focus on open dialogue and immigration was ignoring what they viewed as major cultural and security risks in the West.
So, when you pull all of these different threads together, the politics, the theology, the cultural anxieties, you start to see that this was never just a simple disagreement. It was a collision of two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world.
At the end of the day, the feud between President Trump and Pope Leo put a huge global spotlight on a deep, unresolved tension. It forces all of us to think about the fundamentally different jobs we expect our leaders to do. One, governing the real world with all its harsh realities, and the other guiding the spiritual world with its moral ideals.
And that leaves us with this final, really challenging question. In our complex world with all its global problems, where exactly do we draw the line between the moral authority of a spiritual leader and the political power of a head of state? That's the question this whole episode really forces us to think about.